In today's episode, we're going to talk about how body based strategies are essential in recovering from traumatic stress. So, if you've been facing traumatic stress or complex trauma, be sure to listen.
Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things and move from being other-led to being self-led so you can live a life you love. Welcome to the Self-Led Woman Podcast.
Hey, it's Jen. Today, we're going to talk about how body based strategies are an essential component in trauma recovery. There's also some questions for you to reflect on. Have you experienced or witnessed traumatic events? And are those experiences still bothering you when you think of them, perhaps even so much so that you avoid thinking of them? Maybe you avoid other reminders of those traumatic experiences. You might find that you vacillate between feeling anxious or on edge or irritable, maybe even angry, and feeling completely shut down, disconnected, and dissociative, rarely finding yourself feeling safe enough to connect, rest, and digest. Do you find yourself constantly assessing situations for safety and for potential threats? Have you tried talk therapy to address these things, but found that it didn't help really all that much, or at least not long term? So, if you've answered yes to some or all of these questions, then you may be struggling with traumatic stress. If you've had talk therapy, you may have found that often the first line of defense is working on skill building and often talking about what happened. And the thing is skill building and cognitive techniques can be helpful, but only using cognitive techniques and skill building to recover from traumatic stress may work in the short term, but in the long term, you may end up feeling more stuck and it could be harder to heal. And I understand why you might think that cognitive techniques and talk therapy alone could help you recover from the traumatic stress you face. After all, for centuries, therapists, gurus, and people like me have focused on talk therapies and techniques to help you shift how you think about the problem. And those things can help and may help for a while. But the problem is if you've been struggling with traumatic stress, that stress is encoded in your body, not in your language. So if you caught an earlier podcast episode with me about body-based interventions will help you recover faster and more fully, then some of this may sound familiar. So here's how traumatic stress gets caught in the body. So when we are in a traumatic situation, when we are facing threat, our body goes into our protective systems. And in those systems, in the middle of trauma, the parts of our brain that are in charge of memory, like our hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex is involved with language. Those parts are not really active. They're pretty quiet in the brain when we are going through traumatic stress. And so a lot of times, the narrative memory, the story about what happened isn't there. And instead, these memories get encoded in body sensations like smells, sounds, a feeling or vibe. We might have a body sensation around a certain kind of energy, right? Certain music. And so any language that we develop or any story that we develop often stems from those feelings. They could even be images, but not necessarily a continuous narrative or story about what happened. And so in order to heal, we need to get to the root of the stored memories, which we now know is in the body, not in the thinking. So this is why you can go to years and years and years of talk therapy, or even just talk about the chronic traumatic stress that you've experienced for hours and hours and never really feel better. Alternatively, you may feel better for a while, but then oftentimes those same problems will resurface, maybe just in different ways. So you might be asking, okay, that's great, Jen, but what do you do instead? So the cool thing is you can use body-based techniques to heal so that you can move the trauma from your body and reorient yourself to the present where the trauma is no longer happening. A lot of times, what happens when we face a traumatic event is parts of our body get stuck in the past. And so, as we work with the body, we reorient to the present and help ourselves realize that, oh, that was then, this is now. And in 2022, I'm safe or safe enough. And so there's several body-based therapies that can be used to do this. My two favorite are internal family systems, or IFS, which we covered in my last podcast episode that I mentioned earlier, and trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga. And today I'd like to share about trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, which is actually a protocol that I feel honored to get to be a steward of when it's a fit for people. So trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, which you will also hear me call TCTSY, is a body-based, empirically validated technique that's been shown to be effective as a clinical intervention for complex trauma or even for treatment-resistant PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. TCTSY has its foundations in trauma theory, attachment theory, neuroscience, and hatha yoga, with an emphasis on body-based yoga forms and breathing practices. So the methodology is based on central components of hatha yoga, where participants engage in a series of physical movements and forms. But the elements of the standard hatha yoga style are modified to maximize the experience of self-empowerment and cultivate a more positive relationship to one's body. And in some cases, it can be just reconnecting with your body at all. Unlike many public yoga classes, TCTSY doesn't use hands-on or physical adjustments or even direct individual verbal feedback to influence a participant's form. Instead, TCTSY presents opportunities for participants to be in charge of themselves based on a felt sense of their own body. And so, although we do use physical forms and movement, the emphasis is not on the external expression or appearance of those forms, like doing it right or receiving approval from an external authority. Rather, the focus is on the internal experience of the participant. This shift in orientation from an external focus to internal is a key attribute of trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga as a complementary treatment for complex trauma. And so with our approach of trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, the power resides within the individual, not the trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga facilitator. Further, by focusing on that felt sense of the body to inform choice-making, trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga allows participants to restore the connection of mind and body and cultivate a sense of agency that often gets compromised as a result of the trauma that many participants have faced. So if you're wondering what this actually looks like in practice, in a moment, I'm about to share with you a 5-minute trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga practice. I will offer a seated practice with simple forms. And again, the focus is not on the movement itself or having it to be a certain way. Instead, it's on the participant's individual experience. And so what this looks like in practice, you may hear me say things like, if you like, maybe, perhaps, you could try, things like that. And those are invitations to possibly explore movement. If you'll also hear the words, you have a choice throughout the practice. I've had some participants initially tell me that that's annoying because at first, like there's thinking parts of the brain that are like, well, I know I have a choice, right? And sometimes we cognitively think that, sometimes we don't believe we have a choice. But what I've heard from participants over time is that that message of I have a choice gets encoded more and more deeply so that they really do start to believe they have a choice, right? And so I'd like to invite you to about a 5-minute practice. I didn't bring my stopwatch, so I'm going to be checking my watch. So if you like, you might find a seat. You could be seated on a chair, on the floor. You could be seated on your bed, and you might lengthen your spine. So you could be lifting your spine to the sky, and you may be noticing your breath. So you might notice your breath. And one way to notice the breath might be to notice the pacing of it. Like, are your inhales and exhales similar in length, or are they different? So you might notice the breath. You might have your eyes open or closed. And maybe turning your head to one side. So you could turn your head to one side. So you might be turning your head to one side, maybe turning it part of the way, or you could turn it as far as you can. You're in charge of how far to turn your head, if you're turning it at all. If your head is turned to one side, you might bring it back to center and maybe switching sides. So you could turn your head the other way. So you might have your head turned to one side, maybe turning it part of the way, maybe turning it as far as it goes. You have a choice. If your head is turned to the side, you might bring it back to center, and you could tilt your head to one side. So maybe your ear goes in the direction of your shoulder. So you might be tilting your head to one side, maybe noticing your breath. And if your head is tilted to one side, you could bring it back to center and maybe tilting your head the other way. So, excuse me, you might have your head tilted to one side. And if your head is tilted to one side, you might notice some sensation in the side of your neck. You might notice it somewhere else. You may not notice any sensation at all. And if your head is turned to the side, you may, or leaning to the side, you might bring it back to center. And if you'd like, you could lower your chin to your chest, maybe staying here, maybe moving your head from side to side. So you could have your chin to your chest, or you might be moving your head from one side to the other. And perhaps bringing your head back to center, you might lift your head if it was lowered. And you could roll your shoulders. So you might move your shoulders, maybe rolling them forward, or you could roll them back, maybe noticing your breath. And perhaps releasing. Then you're welcome to reach one arm up overhead. So you might lift one arm to the sky, and you could stay here. Another option could be to place your bottom hand on your leg, or if you're on a chair or the floor, you could place it on that and maybe leaning to that side. So you might be leaning to one side, maybe noticing your breath. And perhaps returning back to center. If your arm is lifted, you could lower it. Then you're welcome to switch sides. So you could lift your other arm up towards the sky, maybe staying here, maybe placing your bottom arm down. And you could lean to one side. So you might be leaning to one side, maybe noticing your breath. And if you're leaning to one side, you might lift back to center. And if your arm is lifted, you could lower it. And so you're welcome to place your hands on your legs. And maybe as you inhale, you might move your belly forward, maybe lifting your chest and your chin. As you exhale, you could round your spine, maybe lowering your chin towards your chest. You might move between these two shapes. Maybe inhaling, you might come forward, perhaps lifting your chest and your chin. Maybe exhaling, you might round your spine, perhaps lowering your chin towards your chest. And you could move between these two shapes, following your own breath. You might notice some sensation in your torso as you do this, maybe in your neck. As you're ready, you might return back to center. And you're welcome to place your hands in your lap. It's been my pleasure to guide our practice today. Peace. So that was about 5 minutes of trauma centered, trauma sensitive yoga. If you have some unresolved trauma and you'd like to try using yoga shapes to help you recover, I do have another series coming up in January. It's a 10-week series for women. We start on January 14th. And we meet live on Zoom from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., or that's how long I am there. Participants are welcome to be there for as much or as little of that as they like. I also record those classes so that you're welcome to do the recording if being there live is not a fit for you. And oh, I had another thing I wanted to share about that. Yeah, so with this form of trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga, it's more of a what you would think of as a typical yoga practice, not in the sense of what I talked about, how TCTSY is different, but we use a yoga mat and we start out seated and then we move towards standing and do some standing forms. And then we move back down towards seated and eventually doing some things lying supine on our backs. Then we move into rest. So that tends to be what the class looks like. If you are interested in that and you would like more information, or you want to take the first step, which is to complete the very brief intake assessment so that I can just assess clinical fit, because it is a trauma treatment. We want to make sure that it's clinically appropriate at this time for you. But if that sounds like a fit for you, or you just like more information, I'd invite you to check out the show notes for the link. You can also find it on my website, pathwaysuniversitymn.com. And then it's a slash TCTSY. But you can also just go to the main website and there's a TCTSY link right there. Take care.